She was 26 when Jack Harmon decided their life together was over. The decision was not communicated in person, nor was it delivered with the messy, human chaos of a shouted argument or a tearful confession. It was executed with the clean, bloodless efficiency of a corporate restructuring. Lena returned from a 5-day coastal survey in the Outer Hebrides, tired from the wind and the work, to find her key no longer fit the lock of their shared London flat. On the top step, placed with geometric precision, were her 2 rugged Pelican field cases. Tucked under the handle of the larger one was a single sheet of A4 paper, folded crisply in 3, protected from the city grime by a plastic document sleeve. The note inside was typed. It informed her that their joint bank account had been closed, with the balance transferred to a new account in his name to cover what he termed outstanding shared liabilities. It stated that the lease for the flat had been legally transferred to his sole tenancy. It concluded by wishing her well in her future endeavors. There was no signature, only his typed name at the bottom. It was a termination notice. He had taken everything. He took the Danish mid-century sofa they had spent a month searching for. He took the art prints they had chosen together, the ones she loved for their color, and he loved for their investment potential. He took the dual-zone wine fridge, the German knife block, the complete set of Le Creuset cookware. He took the shared savings, the emergency fund, the holiday jar. He took every quantifiable, documentable, and appraisable asset they had accumulated in 4 years. He conducted an audit of their life and paid himself out in full. He had been methodical. He had been thorough. But he had missed one thing. He forgot to ask about the small, dilapidated Saltmarsh hut on the Norfolk coast her grandfather had left her 3 years ago. He had never asked because he had never been interested in the parts of her life that did not intersect with his own ambitions. Once, she had tried to describe the beauty of the estuary, the vastness of the sky. He had looked up from his tablet, a flicker of professional interest in his eyes, and remarked that Norfolk coastal land was a sleeping asset, tragically hamstrung by environmental protections. He said it would only be worth developing once the wetland orders expired. She never mentioned the hut again. She had grown up understanding the tide the way some children grow up understanding silence. It was a fundamental condition of her world, a breathing rhythm that governed the landscape of her childhood memories. Her grandfather, Edwin Marsh, was the source of this understanding. He was a man who seemed to have been carved from the same patient, weathered material as the Saltmarsh itself. He was quiet, not from a lack of things to say, but from a deep and abiding practice of listening. He listened to the call of the curlew, the whisper of the wind through the sea lavender, and the subtle shift of the silt in the tidal creeks. For 60 years he had been the unofficial custodian of this stretch of coast, a self-appointed warden whose only authority came from the depth of his knowledge and the sincerity of his devotion. He was a coastal ecologist before the term was widely known, a man who kept meticulous, handwritten journals filled with observations on avian migration patterns, saline intrusion, and the slow, inexorable erosion of the coastline. His life was a long, quiet argument for the intrinsic value of a place most people saw as empty, desolate, or simply in the way of progress. Edwin's history was woven into the fabric of the marsh. He had come here as a young man after the war, seeking a quiet place to heal from the noise and the loss. He found work as a warden for a local nature reserve, but his real work was his own. He bought the old wildfowler's hut, a relic from the 19th century, for a pittance from a farmer who considered it a ruin. The farmer saw a decaying structure of tarred wood and reed thatch, slowly surrendering to the elements. Edwin saw a sanctuary. He saw a vantage point. He saw a place to watch and to wait, a base from which to conduct his lifelong study of the estuary's delicate, complex life. He repaired the roof with reeds he cut himself, replaced the single pane of glass in the small window, and built a sturdy observation bench along the back wall. It was not a home, it was an anchor. After his wife, Lena's grandmother, passed away from a sudden illness, the hut became his refuge. While the world saw a man retreating into grief, he was doing the opposite. He was expanding his senses to fill the space she had left, pouring his attention into the subtle, cyclical life of the marsh. He found solace not in forgetting, but in observing the relentless, unceasing continuity of the natural world. He documented the return of the avocets, the slow spread of a new species of cordgrass, the shifting patterns of the winter floods. He fought, in his quiet, persistent way, against drainage schemes and development proposals, armed not with outrage, but with decades of data written in his neat, spidery script. The hut was his laboratory, his library, and his fortress. It was a place of profound meaning, acquired not for its monetary value, but for its immeasurable worth as a point of connection to the world he loved. Lena's childhood summers were spent in that hut, or rather, in the vast, open-air classroom that surrounded it. While other children went to theme parks, she learned to identify the tracks of an otter in the soft mud. While they learned video games, she learned the names of the wading birds by their calls alone. Her grandfather never lectured, he simply pointed. He would touch her shoulder, a gentle pressure, and nod towards a distant flock of knots, their bodies flashing silver and white as they turned in unison against the gray sky. He taught her the particular quality of light that preceded a storm, the specific scent of the air when the tide was turning. He showed her how to read the marsh as a text, a living document written in water, mud, and light. She absorbed it all, not as lessons, but as a kind of second language. It was a language Jack had never been able to hear, let alone understand. She had met him at a university function, a networking event she had been reluctantly dragged to by a well-meaning professor. He had stood out from the crowd of earnest academics and scruffy postgraduate students. He was sharp, tailored, and possessed a focused intensity that she, in her quiet world of patient observation, found compelling. He was attentive in the specific way that lonely people find irresistible. He asked questions about her research, not just polite ones, but detailed, probing questions that made her feel seen and appreciated. He learned the vocabulary of her world, estuarine habitats, sediment accretion, biomass, and used it like a key to unlock her trust. For a time, it felt like a perfect partnership. He was the solid, ambitious structure. She was the deep, quiet current. He navigated the world of finance and contracts, a world she found baffling and exhausting. She navigated the natural world, a world he found interesting in the abstract, like a beautiful photograph of a place he had no desire to visit. The failure of their relationship was not a single, catastrophic event, but a slow, creeping erosion, like the tide wearing away a sandbank. He began to see her dedication not as a passion, but as a poor career choice. Her fieldwork, which required her to be away for days or weeks at a time, became an inconvenience. Her salary, modest by his venture capital standards, became a topic of gentle but persistent concern. He started keeping a mental ledger of their shared life. He tallied his contributions against hers, his long hours at the office against her days in the wind and rain. He could not assign a value to her knowledge, to her deep, quiet competence, and so, in his accounting, it was worth nothing. The hut, her inheritance from Edwin, remained her secret. It was too precious, too deeply infused with a value he could never recognize, to expose to his transactional gaze. It was a part of her soul, and she had learned, slowly and painfully, to keep her soul separate from his balance sheet. With less than £300 to her name, Lena bought a one-way train ticket from King's Cross to a small station in Norfolk. The journey was a slow, deliberate unwinding. The dense, frantic architecture of London gave way to the clipped, orderly suburbs, which in turn dissolved into the vast, flat expanse of East Anglia. The sky opened up, a huge, dramatic canvas of shifting gray clouds. She watched the landscape flatten, the horizon expand, and felt a corresponding shift within herself. The tight knot of panic and humiliation that had been lodged in her chest since she'd found her bags on the doorstep began to loosen. She was unmoored, adrift, but she was moving toward the one fixed point she had left in the world. She carried a single suitcase with a few changes of clothes, her binoculars, and her grandfather's oldest field guide. Her professional life was packed away in the 2 Pelican cases, now stored in a locker at the station. Her personal life fit in a small backpack. From the station, she took a local bus that rattled along narrow lanes flanked by hedgerows, finally depositing her in the small market town where her grandfather had done his shopping. She walked to the offices of Abernathy & Sons Solicitors, a firm that had been handling local affairs for over a century. Mr. Abernathy, a man in his late 70s with eyes as kind and clear as a summer sky, had been Edwin's solicitor and friend. He greeted her not as a client, but as a returning family member. He sat her down in a worn leather armchair that smelled of beeswax and old paper and made her a cup of tea. He didn't ask about her sudden appearance or her single suitcase. He simply said, "It's good to see you, Lena. Your grandfather would be glad you've come home." He retrieved a large manila envelope from a heavy iron safe. Inside was the deed to the small parcel of land the hut sat on, and a single, heavy iron key, its surface pitted and softened with rust. "Edwin always said the hut wasn't a piece of property," Mr. Abernathy recalled, passing the key to her. "He said it was a responsibility. He knew you'd understand what he meant." The key felt solid and real in her palm, a stark contrast to the intangible, digital life that had just been taken from her. She then walked the final 2 miles out of town, following a public footpath that traced the edge of the farmland before giving way to the marsh itself. The air changed, growing heavy with the scent of salt and damp earth. And then she saw it. The hut stood silhouetted against the wide, pale sky, smaller and more weathered than she remembered, but defiantly upright. It was a dark, solid shape in the immense, horizontal landscape. Its reed thatch was frayed and patchy, some of the tarred wooden planks on the walls had warped, and the whole structure leaned slightly, as if bracing itself against the perpetual wind. But it was still there. It had what her grandfather called good bones. It had endured. The iron key turned in the old lock with a groan of protest, the sound of metal yielding after years of silence. The door swung inward, and she stepped out of the wind into the still, contained air of the hut. It was a single, small room, no more than 12 feet square. Light filtered through the one small, grime-coated window and the open doorway, illuminating a space that was less an interior and more a continuation of the marsh outside. The air smelled of salt-impregnated wood, of dry reeds, of the faint, peaty scent of the mudflats at low tide. It was the smell of her childhood. It was the smell of her grandfather. The space was Spartan. Against one wall was a simple wooden cot with a thin, flattened mattress. A small, pot-bellied stove stood in one corner, a stack of dried driftwood beside it. In the center of the room was a single, sturdy wooden chair and a small, scarred table. But the most important feature was the observation bench that ran the entire length of the back wall, directly beneath a long, narrow slot window designed for watching the birds without disturbing them. This was her grandfather's throne. It was from here that he had watched the world. Lena ran her hand along the worn, smooth wood of the bench, her fingers tracing the grain. She remembered sitting here beside him for hours, sharing a flask of tea, speaking in whispers or not at all, their silence a shared language of comfortable companionship. He had once shown her a loose board at the far end of the bench, right in the corner. "Every good ship has a hiding place," he'd said with a wink. She knelt down, her fingers searching for the familiar notch in the wood. She found it, and with a bit of effort, pried the board free. In the dark cavity beneath, there was a rectangular object wrapped in oilcloth. She lifted it out. It was a large, old biscuit tin, its painted sides faded, but its edges sealed shut with a thick layer of wax. She carried it to the table and used the back of a spoon from her pack to break the seal. The lid came off with a soft hiss. Inside, nestled in dry, brittle paper, were tight, dense bundles of old 20-pound notes held together with faded rubber bands. Beneath them, a canvas bag clinked with a heavy, satisfying weight. She emptied it onto the table. A small hoard of gold sovereigns gleamed in the dim light, their milled edges sharp, their surfaces bearing the profiles of forgotten kings and a young queen. She sat down in the wooden chair and began to count. The cash, old but still legal tender, amounted to just over 30,000 pounds. The sovereigns, she knew, were worth a considerable amount more. It was not a fortune, but it was enough. It was more than enough. It was enough to begin again. Tucked into the side of the tin, she found one last item. It was a single sheet of old, heavy-gauge paper, the kind her grandfather used for his field surveys, covered in his familiar, elegant script. She unfolded it carefully. "My dearest Lena," it began. "If you are reading this, then you have found yourself in need of a safe harbor. I hope you never would, but I know the world can be a sudden and unforgiving tide. This place, this hut, has always been my anchor. May it now be yours. The money is for repairs and for time. Time is the most important thing. It gives you the chance to think, to watch, and to wait for the tide to turn in your favor. The roofer in town is named Silas Croft. His father was a good man who taught him the old ways of thatching. You can trust him, but do as much of the work yourself as you can. There is a deep and quiet satisfaction in mending what is broken. Remember what I taught you. The marsh endures. It is scoured by storms and flooded by the sea, but it always returns. It is patient, it is resilient, and it knows its own worth. That is your inheritance, Lena. Not this hut or the money, but the knowledge of that resilience. It is in your blood. You are a Marsh, after all. With all my love, grandfather." The first call she made was to Silas Croft. He answered on the second ring, his voice a warm Norfolk burr. When she introduced herself as Edwin Marsh's granddaughter, the tone shifted from professional courtesy to genuine warmth. He remembered her as a little girl, trailing after her grandfather with a pair of oversized binoculars. He came out to the hut the next morning, a tall, wiry man with hands as tough and calloused as old leather. He walked around the small structure, his eyes scanning the roofline, his fingers probing the decaying reeds. He praised the original framework, noting the strength of the old oak beams. He looked at Lena, his gaze direct and kind. "Your granddad built this to last," he said. "He didn't cut corners. Proper job." He quoted her a price for the materials that was more than fair, and when she asked about labor, he smiled. "I'll get the main ridge done for you, get it watertight. The rest? Well, the rest I can teach you. Edwin taught my father about the birds. It's the least I can do to teach his granddaughter about the reeds." For the next 2 weeks, Lena's world shrank to the size of the hut's roof. Her days fell into a rhythm of physical work that was both exhausting and deeply restorative. Silas showed her how to dress the reeds, how to bundle them into tight sheaves called yelms, and how to secure them to the roof battens with steel sways. She learned the feel of the thatching needle in her hand, the specific tension needed on the twine, the way to layer the reeds so they would shed water for decades. Her hands, accustomed to the delicate work of calipers and sample jars, became blistered, then calloused. Her muscles ached with a satisfying soreness. She was tired at the end of each day, but it was a clean, honest fatigue, born of tangible effort. She found a quiet joy in the methodical process, in the slow, visible progress of the new golden thatch spreading across the old, dark roof. She was not just repairing a structure, she was reclaiming a skill, connecting herself to a tradition that was as old as the landscape itself. She was learning the craft of shelter, and in doing so was building a shelter for her own bruised spirit. The community, in its quiet, unobtrusive way, began to validate her presence. Silas told stories of her grandfather as they worked, painting a portrait of a man respected not for his wealth or status, but for his integrity and his deep, unassuming wisdom. Once the roof was sound and watertight, Lena turned her attention to the interior. The task became a form of meditation, a slow and deliberate process of personalization through restoration. She did not want to erase the hut's history. She wanted to honor it, to make it a living part of her own story. She began with the floor. The old wooden planks were gray with age and coated with a fine layer of salt and sand. She spent 3 days on her hands and knees with a bucket of soapy water and a stiff brush, scrubbing away the accumulated grime of decades. As she worked, the true character of the wood began to emerge. The tight grain of the old pine, the dark whorls of the knots, the faint, half-moon scars left by her grandfather's work boots. When the planks were clean, she sanded them by hand, the rhythmic rasp of the sandpaper a soothing sound in the quiet hut. Finally, she sealed them with 3 coats of tung oil, which brought out a deep, warm, honey-colored glow. The floor, once a drab and dusty surface, now seemed to radiate a soft light, anchoring the small space with a sense of warmth and solidity. She tackled the single window next, painstakingly scraping away the old, cracked putty and peeling paint from the frame. She polished the small brass latch and hinges until they gleamed. The pane of glass itself was thick and slightly warped, a relic from another era. She cleaned it carefully, inside and out, removing the film of salt spray and dust that had obscured the view. When she was finished, the light that streamed into the hut was clearer, sharper. The vast panorama of the Saltmarsh, the shifting greens and ochres of the grasses, the silver ribbons of the tidal creeks, the immense dome of the sky, became a living painting framed by the old wood. It was as if she had adjusted the focus on her world, bringing everything into a new, more vibrant clarity. She mended the old canvas on her grandfather's cot, stitching the worn patches with thick, waxed thread. She cleaned the pot-bellied stove, polishing its cast-iron surface with graphite until it shone with a dark, metallic luster. She did not buy new things. She had no desire to fill the space with objects that had no story. Instead, she found a deep satisfaction in the act of repair, in taking what was old and broken and making it functional and beautiful again. Each repaired object became a testament to her own growing sense of competence and self-reliance. As she worked, she arranged the space for her new life. The observation bench remained the heart of the hut, her place for watching and thinking. She set up her grandfather's small table by the window, creating a workspace where she could write and draw. The single wooden chair was her place for reading in the evenings, by the light of an oil lamp. The hut was no longer just a shelter from the storm. It was becoming her home, a space that reflected not who she had been with Jack, but who she was becoming on her own. The money her grandfather had left was a buffer, a gift of time, but Lena knew it would not last forever. She needed work, not just for the income, but for the sense of purpose and connection it provided. She updated her curriculum vitae on the town library's slow computer and sent it to the Norfolk Wildlife Trust, the very organization her grandfather had volunteered with for most of his life. 2 days later, she received an email from the head of coastal programs, a Dr. Eris Thorne. The name was familiar. She had seen it in her grandfather's correspondence. Eris invited her for an interview, which turned out to be less a formal interrogation and more a long conversation over coffee in a local cafe. Dr. Thorne, a sharp, energetic woman in her 50s, had known Edwin professionally for over 20 years. She spoke of his work with a deep and genuine respect, calling his handwritten journals one of the most significant long-term ecological datasets in the country. She had read Lena's own published papers on estuarine habitats and was impressed. "Your grandfather's work was foundational," she said, stirring her coffee. "You've built on that foundation with modern techniques. It's a powerful combination." She offered Lena a part-time position as a coastal monitoring officer. The work would involve surveying the very same stretch of Saltmarsh that Lena now called home. The pay was modest, but the work was exactly what she was trained to do, what she loved to do. It was a perfect fit, a job that felt less like a new beginning and more like a seamless continuation of her family's legacy. On her days off, when she wasn't out on the marsh measuring salinity levels or counting wading bird populations, Lena began a personal project. In a large, sea-worn wooden chest tucked under the cot, she had found her grandfather's complete collection of field journals, dozens of hardbound notebooks filled with 60 years of observations. The pages were a dense tapestry of his spidery handwriting, intricate sketches of birds and plants, and tables of tidal data. It was his life's work, an invaluable record of a changing landscape. Carefully, methodically, she began the process of organizing and archiving them. She bought archival quality boxes and cataloged each journal by date. As she read through his entries, she felt a profound connection to him, a conversation across time. She saw the marsh through his eyes, witnessed the changes he had documented, and understood the depth of his patient, unwavering love for this place. Inspired by his example, she started her own journal, a continuation of his. She used the same brand of notebook he had favored and began to record her own observations. She sketched the samphire and the sea aster, noted the arrival of the first pink-footed geese of the autumn, and mapped the subtle daily changes in the patterns of the tidal creeks. The journal was not for a job or a publication. It was for herself. It was an act of paying attention, a way of rooting herself ever more deeply in the life of the marsh. It was a way of honoring her grandfather's legacy by actively participating in it. The locals, who had at first watched her with a reserved curiosity, began to accept her as part of the landscape. Their connections were quiet, understated gestures of welcome. An old fisherman who had known Edwin since they were boys would leave a freshly caught sea bass on her doorstep in the early morning. A retired warden, a woman who had worked with her grandfather on the reserve, would stop by on her daily walk, sharing stories of Edwin's stubborn battles with the local council. A local artist, captivated by the stark beauty of the hut against the sky, would set up her easel a respectful distance away, giving Lena a silent, companionable nod. They were a quiet chorus, their presence confirming the rightness of her being there. They didn't see her as a newcomer, an outsider from the city. They saw her as Edwin Marsh's granddaughter, the natural inheritor of his place in their community. They recognized the same quiet competence, the same deep affinity for the marsh that they had respected in him. Through them, Lena began to understand that her inheritance was not just the hut, but a place within a community, a web of relationships built on shared history and mutual respect. She was no longer just a displaced person. She was the custodian of a legacy, and she was home. He arrived on a gray October morning. The air was cold and damp, carrying the salty tang of the high tide. A persistent drizzle had softened the landscape, blurring the line between the marsh and the sky. Lena was on a small ladder, her hands deftly working a bundle of reeds into a patch on the lower part of the roof, a repair she was now confident enough to do herself. She was so focused on the task, on the feel of the reeds and the pull of the twine, that she didn't hear him approach. It was the sound of his voice that startled her. "Lena?" He sounded uncertain, his voice thin in the vast, open space. She paused, a half-hitched knot in her hand, and looked down. Jack stood on the muddy path about 20 feet from the hut, looking utterly and completely out of place. He was wearing a dark, expensive-looking cashmere coat, the collar turned up against the drizzle. His leather shoes, clearly designed for polished city pavements, were already stained with mud. He looked smaller than she remembered, diminished by the immense, raw beauty of the landscape he was standing in. His eyes were wide, taking in the restored hut, the neat stack of firewood, the tidy path she had laid with cockle shells. He was bewildered. This solid, tangible evidence of her resilience, of a life she had built entirely without him, was something his calculations had not accounted for. He had left her with nothing, and she had somehow created this. It did not compute. He took a hesitant step forward. I didn't know about this place," he said. It was not an apology, but a confession of a lapse in his own thoroughness. It was an admission that his audit of her life had been incomplete, that there had been an asset he had failed to identify and account for. Lena remained on the ladder. She did not stop her work. She simply looked down at him, her expression calm and unreadable. "You never asked," she said. Her voice was quiet, a simple statement of fact, yet it carried the weight of their entire history. It was the core of his failure. He had never been curious about the parts of her that held no value for him. He had never inquired about her family, her childhood, her history, the quiet internal landscapes that defined her. He saw the flicker of comprehension in his eyes, the dawning, uncomfortable awareness of his own profound lack of attention. He shifted his weight, the expensive shoes sinking a little deeper into the mud. "I've been thinking," he began, the words vague and unformed. "About us. Maybe there's something we can—" He trailed off, unable to articulate what he wanted. A reconciliation? A second chance? Or simply to re-annex this newly discovered territory of her life into his own? Lena finished her knot, pulling it tight with a practiced flick of her wrist. She looked from her hands to his face. The anger she might have once felt was gone, replaced by a deep, quiet clarity. She saw him not as a monster, but as a man with a fundamental limitation, like someone who was colorblind trying to appreciate a sunset. He could only perceive value that could be measured, counted, and owned. "No, Jack," she said, her voice gentle but absolutely final. "There isn't." There was no argument left in him. He saw the truth of her words in the calm certainty of her gaze. He had no leverage here, no assets to negotiate with. He was a foreigner in a land where his currency was worthless. He gave a small, defeated nod, turned, and walked back the way he had come, his muddy shoes leaving a trail of dark prints on the path that would be washed away by the next high tide. That evening, Lena sat in the open doorway of the hut, a mug of hot tea warming her hands. She watched the tide turn, the sea slowly, inexorably flooding the network of creeks and channels, transforming the marsh from a landscape of earth to a landscape of water. The drizzle had stopped, and the clouds were beginning to break apart. In the west, the setting sun painted the undersides of the clouds in shades of bruised purple and soft, glowing apricot. The air grew still and cold as the light failed, and in the deepening twilight, the first stars began to appear, sharp and brilliant in the clear, clean air. She thought about her grandfather, about the 60 years he had spent watching this same daily miracle. He had understood that the marsh's strength was not in its resistance to the tide, but in its ability to yield, to be flooded, and then to re-emerge, changed but whole. She thought about Jack, walking back toward a world of numbers and valuations, a world that seemed so small and insignificant from here. He had tried to quantify her, to fit her into his ledger, and had failed. He could not see the value in patience, in resilience, in the deep, quiet knowledge of a single place. His worldview was a closed system, and she was, and always had been, part of something open, wild, and immeasurable. Her inheritance, she finally understood, was not the sturdy little hut or the sovereigns hidden beneath the floor. It was the marsh itself. It was the resilience in her blood, the patience in her bones. It was the quiet, unshakable knowledge of her own worth, a worth that, like the beauty of the fading light, could never be captured on a balance sheet. Jack Harmon had taken everything he could count. He had taken the furniture, the savings, the shared address book, the digital photo albums. He had itemized their life and allocated the assets to himself, confident in the cold logic of his accounting. He had stripped her of every possession that had a market value, every item that could be listed, sold, or leveraged. He believed he had left her with an empty slate, a zero balance. He had been precise. He had been efficient. He had been thorough in his own limited way. But he forgot the old Saltmarsh hut her grandfather left. He forgot the wind and the tide, the patient work of hands, the quiet strength of a legacy rooted in mud and memory. It was the best thing he ever forgot.